I'm Thomas, 48, and I built my company, Miller Analytics, from the ground up. Blood, sweat, and years of sacrifice. Started it in my 20s, worked crazy hours, made smart hires, and now it's one of the top data consulting firms in the industry. I've been married to Melanie, 45, for 22 years. We have a son, Jason, 23, who recently finished his MBA and has been shadowing me in the company, learning the ropes. From the outside, everything looked perfect. Great marriage, successful business, good kid. But the thing about cracks? They start small. A few months ago, Melanie started acting different. At first, I chalked it up to stress. She was distant, constantly on her phone, always stepping out for private calls. And it wasn't like she had a high-powered career. She did some charity work, had her book club, went to yoga. Nothing that would require her to be glued to her phone at all hours. Then, little things started adding up. She suddenly took an interest in my company in ways she never had before. Asking about my shares, what would happen if something happened to me, if I had any backup plans. At first, I thought she was just concerned about security. After all, we'd built a life together, and she'd want to know what would happen in case of an emergency. But then, she started pushing. Thomas, maybe you should transfer some shares to me, just in case. You know, if something were to happen, it would be a nightmare to sort everything out legally. I laughed it off at first. Mel, I've got contingency plans in place. Jason would take over if anything happened to me. She didn't like that answer. I could see it in her face. Then, the biggest red flag hit me like a brick wall. One night, I was up late working in my home office. Melanie had gone to bed, or so I thought. I got up to grab a drink, and as I walked past the staircase, I heard her voice, soft but urgent. No, he hasn't done it yet. Pause. I'm trying. But he's stubborn. She went silent. I stepped into the hall, and she was at the bottom of the stairs, phone in hand, frozen like a deer in headlights. Who are you talking to? I asked. She recovered quickly. Just Susan from book club. We were talking about a fundraiser. Lies. I didn't push it right then, but something inside me twisted. That wasn't a casual conversation. That was something else. I started watching. Paying attention. And what I saw made my blood run cold. Melanie wasn't just acting weird, she was planning something. After that night, I started paying attention like never before. And let me tell you, once you start looking for the signs, they're everywhere. Melanie was careful, but not careful enough. I caught her deleting messages, stepping out whenever her phone rang, and the biggest tell, she never left her phone unattended anymore. She used to leave it charging on the kitchen counter or on the nightstand. Now, that thing was glued to her hand, always face down. And then came the offer. Patrick Lawson, CEO of Global Strategy Incorporated, reached out to me personally. Now, GS Incorporated is a corporate giant, a data powerhouse that's been trying to expand its reach for years. We'd crossed paths before, but I never took their offers seriously. My company, Miller Analytics, was independent, and I intended to keep it that way. But Patrick was persistent. Thomas, let's have dinner. I have a proposition I think you'll find very interesting. I should have said no. I almost did. But with everything going on with Melanie, my gut told me to go. Something about this felt off, and I needed to see what he was really after. We met at a high-end restaurant downtown. Patrick, always the charmer, greeted me like an old friend. But I wasn't fooled. This man was a shark. We made small talk, then he got down to business. I want Miller Analytics under the global strategy umbrella, Thomas. We'd make a hell of a team. I took a sip of my whiskey and leaned back. I've told you before, I'm not selling. Patrick smiled. Oh, I don't need you to sell. Just a partnership. We acquire a majority stake, you stay on as CEO, and you walk away with a very comfortable deal. He slid a folder across the table. I opened it, and the number inside made my head spin. It was more than I'd ever dreamed of. But something didn't sit right. You're offering way above market value, I said, watching his reaction. Why? Patrick chuckled, swirling his drink. Because Miller is worth it. Then, he looked me dead in the eye. And because I think you might need an exit strategy sooner than you realize. That hit me like a freight train. I kept my face neutral, but my mind was racing. Did he know something? Was this connected to Melanie's sudden interest in my shares? I closed the folder. I'll think about it. Patrick smirked like he already knew my answer. Take your time. But don't wait too long. As I walked out of that restaurant, my stomach was in knots. This wasn't just business. This was something bigger. And I had a feeling Patrick Lawson and my wife were playing a game I wasn't supposed to win. I just didn't know how dangerous it would get. After that meeting with Patrick, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was closing in on me. Melanie kept pushing about the shares, Patrick dangled his suspiciously generous offer, and the pieces weren't adding up. I wasn't paranoid. I built my company by spotting patterns and reading between the lines. And everything in me was screaming that I was being played. I just didn't know how deep it went yet. So, I did what I do best. I started digging. Melanie thought she was being careful, deleting texts and taking calls outside, but she didn't realize I had access to our phone records. When I checked, it was right there in black and white, dozens of calls to Patrick Lawson's personal number over the last few months. Some in the middle of the night. Some during the day when she knew I was in meetings. There was no innocent explanation for this. Melanie barely knew the ins and outs of my company, let alone had a reason to be talking to the one man who was aggressively trying to take it from me. That was my first real confirmation. But I needed more. I went to someone I trusted in my company, one of my IT guys who had been with me for years. Told him to check if anything unusual had come through my personal business account, just in case. A few hours later, he called me into his office, looking uneasy. Said he found something. Turns out, my inbox had been filtering out a string of emails from an unknown sender, messages I never saw, automatically flagged as spam. But they weren't spam. They were warnings. Someone had been trying to reach me. Messages like, "Watch your back and someone close to you is not who they seem." But the one that really made my stomach drop? They don't just want the company. I stared at the screen, my pulse pounding. Someone out there knew what was happening. Someone out there was trying to warn me. But before I could even figure out who, things escalated in a way I never saw coming. 2 nights later, I almost died. I was driving home late from a client meeting, taking my usual route. It was quiet, barely any traffic. I wasn't speeding, wasn't distracted, but as I came up on an intersection, my brakes failed. No warning, no resistance, just a dead pedal beneath my foot. For a split second, I thought maybe I was imagining it, but the car wasn't slowing down. The red light ahead was getting closer, a truck was crossing, and I had seconds to react. I yanked the wheel hard, barely missing the truck, my tires screeching as I swerved onto the shoulder. Somehow, by pure instinct or luck, I managed to avoid crashing. Shaking, I sat there gripping the wheel, heart pounding out of my chest. And that's when I knew, this wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't bad luck. Someone had tampered with my car. Someone wanted me dead. And I had a damn good idea who. Lying in that hospital bed, stitched up and sore, I played it all back in my head. Patrick's cryptic offer, Melanie's sudden obsession with my shares, those warning emails, and now this. I wasn't crazy. Someone was trying to get rid of me, and the only question left was how far they were willing to go. Then Melanie walked in. She looked perfect, like always, hair smoothed back, makeup just right, except for the tears in her eyes. She rushed to my side, grabbed my hand, her fingers trembling just enough to seem real. "Oh my God, Thomas," she choked out, voice breaking. "I thought I lost you." I watched her carefully, every word, every breath. She was good. Almost convincing. Almost. But she underestimated me. She kept talking, how she'd been so worried, how she'd barely slept, how she couldn't imagine life without me. It was a performance, and a damn good one. But when I looked at her, really looked at her, there was something behind her eyes. Not grief. Not relief. Something else. Regret. Not that I got hurt. Not that I almost died. But that I survived. That's when I knew for certain. This wasn't just about my company. This wasn't just about money. Melanie was in on it. I played my part, squeezing her hand weakly, nodding as she went on about how lucky I was. "Yeah," I murmured. "Lucky." She barely let go of me the whole time the doctor was there, asking questions about my recovery, my injuries. But she didn't ask the one thing a normal wife would ask: what happened? She never once wondered why my brakes had failed. Never once asked if it was an accident. Almost like she already knew. Then she made a mistake. "You should rest, sweetheart," she said softly. "We'll talk later. You don't have to worry about anything. I'll handle everything at the company while you recover." There it was. She wasn't just waiting for me to transfer shares anymore. She thought this was her moment. With me out of commission, she could make moves. But she had no idea who she was dealing with. I smiled weakly, nodding, letting her think she had the upper hand. "Yeah," I said. "I trust you." And just like that, she let her guard down. But I wasn't resting. I wasn't recovering. I was planning. The second Melanie walked out of that hospital room, I picked up my phone and called Jason. My son had always been sharp. He grew up watching me build Miller Analytics, learning how the business world worked. If there was one person I could trust, it was him. "Dad." His voice was tight, worried. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," I lied. "But we have a problem." I told him everything. The sudden pressure from Melanie about my shares, Patrick's shady offer, the phone records linking the two of them, and the accident, because that's what it was. An attempted murder. Jason didn't say a word for a long moment. Then when he finally spoke, his voice was low and steady. "They tried to kill you." I exhaled slowly. "Yeah." Jason cursed under his breath. "What do we do?" "We don't panic," I said. "We don't let them know we're onto them. And we sure as hell don't let them win." I had already survived one attempt on my life. There wouldn't be a second. Jason and I spent the next few days planning, carefully, methodically. While I was stuck in that hospital bed, he went to work behind the scenes, locking down access to the company, cutting off any backdoor attempts Melanie might try to make. He kept an eye on her, too, watched her movements, listened carefully. And just as I suspected, she was waiting for something. Then, 2 days later, the real confirmation came. Jason called me, his voice urgent. She met with Patrick. In person. My grip tightened around the phone. "Where?" "Some hotel downtown," he said. She told me she was going to a spa, but I followed her. They were in the lounge, talking for almost an hour. I closed my eyes. That was it. I didn't need any more proof. She wasn't just involved, she was actively conspiring with him. But now, I had an advantage. They thought I was vulnerable, thought I was in the dark, thought I was still the same trusting husband Melanie had been fooling for months. They had no idea I was already ahead of them. I was going to let them play their game. And just when they thought they'd won, I'd rip the rug right out from under them. Lying in that hospital bed, I realized something. I had been playing defense this whole time. Watching, waiting, collecting evidence. But that wasn't who I was. I built Miller Analytics by being 3 steps ahead, by knowing my competition better than they knew themselves. It was time to stop reacting. It was time to start playing. So, I made my first move. The next morning, when Melanie came to visit, I put on the act. I was weak, exhausted, my voice just a little too strained, my movements slow. She ate it up. Sat beside me, stroked my hand, whispered about how much she loved me. But I saw it, the impatience. She wanted to talk about the company. She wanted to know when I'd sign off on her taking over, while I recovered. I gave her exactly what she wanted. "You're right, Mel," I sighed, shaking my head. "This whole thing, it's got me thinking. I need to make sure you and Jason are protected if something ever happens to me." Her eyes lit up, but she forced her voice to stay soft, sympathetic. "Oh honey, that's all I've been trying to say." I nodded slowly. "I've been too stubborn. Maybe it's time I make some changes." She squeezed my hand, fighting to contain her excitement. "I can handle things for you, sweetheart. You just focus on getting better." That was exactly what I wanted her to think. That night, when Jason came by, I told him the plan. "I'm going to make them think they're winning. And when they make their move, we'll be ready." Jason nodded, his jaw clenched. He wasn't just angry anymore. He was determined. "What do you need me to do?" "Keep playing along," I said. "But keep your eyes open. Melanie is going to start feeling comfortable. She'll slip up." And she did. Faster than I expected. By the next day, Melanie was already making calls, moving things behind the scenes. She thought she had free rein. She thought I had finally broken. But she had no idea she was walking right into my trap. The moment I told Melanie I was ready to make some changes, she wasted no time. I could see it in her eyes, relief, excitement, that greedy little flicker she tried to hide. She thought she had one. And that was exactly what I wanted. By the next day, she was already making moves. She started dropping little comments about how Miller Analytics needed strong leadership while I recovered, how it would be easier if she had some decision-making power. She even brought up meeting with lawyers to discuss a temporary transfer of shares. She tried to act casual about it, but I knew better. She had been waiting for this moment. Jason kept a close eye on her while I played my part. I pretended to be exhausted, nodded along whenever she talked about stepping in, and made sure to let her think I wasn't questioning anything. And sure enough, just 2 days later, Jason caught her slipping. I was still in the hospital when he called me. "Dad, you're not gonna believe this," he said, voice tense. "Try me. She met with a lawyer today. Behind our backs." I gripped the phone tighter. "Did you find out what for?" Jason hesitated, then exhaled sharply. "She's drafting paperwork. To gain control of your shares if you're deemed incapacitated." For a second, I saw red. She wasn't just being impatient. She was trying to force my hand. My accident didn't work, so now she was shifting the plan, laying the groundwork to have me legally removed from my own company. And the fact that she was moving this fast told me one thing: she was desperate. That meant I had to push her further. "Let her think it's working," I said, my voice deadly calm. "She'll get sloppy." Jason was silent for a beat, then he sighed. "I don't know how you're keeping it together. Because I'm not done yet." Melanie thought she was so careful, so clever. She thought she had me exactly where she wanted me. She had no idea I was about to turn the whole damn game against her. The moment Jason told me about Melanie's meeting with the lawyer, something inside me clicked into place. She wasn't waiting anymore. She was accelerating her plan, and that meant one thing: she was feeling the pressure. Maybe Patrick was pushing her, maybe she was worried I'd recover faster than expected, or maybe she was just getting greedy. Either way, she had just made her first real mistake. The next time she visited me in the hospital, I watched her more closely than ever. She was all over me, fixing my pillows, stroking my hand, acting like the perfect concerned wife. But the cracks were showing. She kept glancing at my phone like she was waiting for me to check something. And when she talked, she wasn't as careful anymore. "I was thinking," she said, brushing imaginary dust off my blanket. "Since you're going to be here a little longer, maybe I should start handling things at Miller. Just for now. You know, to keep things running smoothly." There it was. She wasn't even trying to be subtle anymore. I sighed, pretending to hesitate. "I don't know, Mel. That's a big step." She gave me a soft, understanding smile, the kind that used to work on me. "Sweetheart, I just want to take care of you. You need to focus on getting better, and the company needs stability. Jason and I can handle things together." I nearly laughed at the way she threw Jason's name in there, like that would make me trust her more. But I kept my face blank, letting her believe she was wearing me down. "You're probably right," I murmured, watching her reaction. Her fingers tightened around mine ever so slightly, and I knew I had her. That night, I called Jason again. "She's getting impatient." "Yeah, no kidding," he muttered. "You should have seen her today. She was practically hovering over my shoulder at the office. I had to fake a meeting just to get away from her." "She knows time is running out," I said. "She needs me out of the picture sooner rather than later." Jason hesitated. "What if she tries something again?" "She will," I said flatly. "And when she does, we'll be ready." I spent the next 2 days playing the part. I let Melanie believe I was still weak, still too exhausted to fight back. I even told her I was thinking about transferring some temporary control over to her. That was all she needed to hear. By the following afternoon, Jason called me again, this time sounding urgent. "Dad, we have a problem." I tensed. "What happened?" "She called a board meeting," he said. "Without telling me. Without telling you." I sat up straighter, ignoring the ache in my ribs. "When?" "Tomorrow morning." I overheard her on the phone with Patrick. I clenched my jaw. This was it. She was making her move. "Good," I said after a moment. "Let her." Jason was silent for a beat. "You sure? She wants to take me out of the picture?" I exhaled slowly, my mind already working through every possible outcome. Then let's make sure she walks right into the spotlight instead. The trap was set. Now, all I had to do was let her think she had one. The next morning, I signed myself out of the hospital against medical advice. The doctor protested, but I didn't care. I had bigger problems than a few cracked ribs. Jason picked me up, and as soon as I settled into the passenger seat, I turned to him. "Tell me everything." Jason gripped the wheel tight as we sped toward Miller Analytics. She sent out a last-minute notice last night, calling for an emergency board meeting. I only found out because one of the senior members, Greg, called me, confused about why you weren't the one organizing it. She told them you were too weak to attend and that, in your best interest, she'd be presenting a temporary leadership transition plan. "She's moving faster than I thought," I muttered. "She's worried I'll come back too soon." Jason nodded. "She's playing it like she's the devoted wife, just stepping in to help. But that's not all. Patrick Lawson is going to be there." That made my blood run cold. Patrick had no reason to be at a Miller Analytics board meeting unless there was already an understanding between him and Melanie. He wasn't just there to observe, he was there to close the deal. "She's handing me over," I said, the realization hitting like a punch to the gut. "She's setting me up to lose everything in front of the board." Jason's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "Not if we stop her." We arrived 15 minutes before the meeting started. I moved carefully, still feeling the weight of my injuries, but the adrenaline kept me steady. Jason had already arranged everything we needed. I just had to play my part. When we walked into the boardroom, the entire room went silent. Melanie was standing at the head of the table mid-sentence, looking like she'd just seen a ghost. Patrick, seated beside her, leaned back in his chair, clearly amused but not surprised. "Thomas," Melanie gasped, quickly masking her shock with concern. "You shouldn't be here. You're not well." I held up a hand. "Sit down, Melanie." My voice was calm, but firm. The authority in it silenced her instantly. I turned to the board, nodding at the familiar faces. "I apologize for the short notice. I understand my wife has called this meeting in my absence to discuss a leadership transition. Which is strange, considering I'm still very much alive and in charge." Some of the board members exchanged uneasy glances. Patrick, however, just smirked. "Thomas, I think we all just want what's best for the future of Miller Analytics," he said smoothly. I gave him a sharp look. "You mean your future, Patrick?" A flicker of irritation crossed his face before he recovered. I turned back to Melanie, my voice ice cold. "Since you've gone through all this trouble to hold this meeting, why don't you tell us exactly what your plan was?" She swallowed hard, glancing at Patrick for reassurance before she put on the performance of her life. "Thomas, I was worried about you. We all were. The company needs leadership, and I thought that if something were to happen to you, something like my brakes mysteriously failing." I cut in. The room went dead silent. Melanie's face paled. I don't know what you're talking about." I took a deep breath, keeping my eyes locked on hers. "Then let me explain it to you. Someone tampered with my car. Someone who had a lot to gain if I didn't make it." I let that sit for a moment, watching her squirm before I continued. "And since that didn't work, that same someone decided to call an emergency board meeting to declare me unfit to lead and conveniently transfer power over to themselves." One of the senior board members, Greg, cleared his throat. "Melanie, is this true?" I would never," Melanie started, but her voice was shaking now. I turned to Jason, who nodded and pulled out his phone. "Dad, should I play the recording now?" Melanie's head snapped toward him. "What?" Jason held up the screen. "You're meeting with Patrick at the hotel. You really should be more careful where you discuss conspiracy and corporate fraud." Her face drained of all color. Patrick, for the first time since I walked in, looked genuinely concerned. Jason tapped his screen, and Melanie's voice filled the boardroom. "He hasn't done it yet. I'm trying. But he's stubborn." Patrick's voice followed, calm and calculated. "Then we need to move to the next phase. We can't afford any more delays." The room erupted in whispers. Melanie lunged for Jason's phone, but I stepped between them. "It's over," I said, my voice low and firm. "I have more than enough evidence to press charges. The only thing you should be thinking about now is how much prison time you're about to get." She shook her head, eyes darting around the room, looking for support. No, Thomas, please, I was manipulated. I didn't know what Patrick was planning. I scoffed. You expect me to believe that after everything? The secret meetings, the phone calls, the attempt to take over the company? You knew exactly what you were doing. She turned to the board, desperate now. I was trying to protect the company. Patrick, he pressured me. Patrick abruptly stood, adjusting his suit jacket. Melanie, you should stop talking now. For the first time, she realized Patrick wasn't going to save her. Security arrived minutes later. Jason had already made the necessary calls. Melanie was escorted out, screaming about how she did it for us, how she never wanted this to happen. Patrick, ever the businessman, simply walked out with his lawyers, knowing full well the battle ahead would be a legal one. But I wasn't worried. I had already won. When Melanie was dragged out of that boardroom, screaming and pleading, I didn't feel anger anymore. I didn't feel relief either. Just exhaustion. The board meeting ended in chaos. Half of them were in shock, the other half already talking legal action. Greg, one of the senior board members, stepped up. Thomas, what's your next move? I exhaled slowly, looking around the room. Damage control. Jason and I spent the next few hours handling the fallout. Legal teams were already drafting statements, and our PR department was preparing to address the inevitable media storm once news broke. Miller Analytics was too big for this kind of scandal to stay quiet. Patrick Lawson was powerful, but not invincible, and his involvement in this conspiracy was about to cost him everything. Melanie, though, that was personal. I knew she'd try to twist the story, make herself the victim. That's exactly what she did. By the time I got home that evening, the media was already buzzing. Reports were coming out that Patrick Lawson had stepped down from Global Strategy Incorporated amid an undisclosed internal investigation. We all knew what that meant. He was scrambling to contain the damage. Meanwhile, Melanie had gone into full damage control mode. She called me. Twice. Left voicemails, crying, saying she was scared and that she needed to explain. I didn't answer. She didn't deserve another second of my time. Jason sat across from me at the kitchen table, watching the news updates roll in on his phone. She's going to keep trying, he muttered. I nodded. She's desperate. But it doesn't matter anymore. We have everything we need. The next morning, she proved Jason right. I woke up to a long email from Melanie. A final plea. She claimed she had been pressured by Patrick, that she never wanted to hurt me, that she only went along with it because she thought it was the only way to keep our family safe. She blamed Patrick for manipulating her, said she had been caught up in something bigger than she realized. But then, at the very end of the email, she slipped. You don't have to do this, Thomas. You don't have to ruin me. That was all I needed to see. She wasn't sorry. She was just scared of the consequences. I forwarded the email to my lawyers and blocked her. Jason and I spent the next few days making sure Miller Analytics was secure. Melanie was officially removed from any legal connection to the company, and my legal team ensured that she couldn't get a dime from me after everything she had done. The divorce proceedings were already underway. She would leave with nothing. The police were investigating the car accident now. Jason and I provided all the evidence we had, and it was only a matter of time before Melanie and Patrick faced real legal consequences. But even after all of that, even after I had won, I couldn't shake the weight in my chest. 22 years of marriage, gone. Everything I thought I knew about my wife had been a lie. She hadn't just betrayed me, she had tried to erase me. Jason picked up on it. One night, as we sat in my office, he leaned forward, his voice softer than usual. You did the right thing, Dad. I nodded but didn't answer. He studied me for a moment, then added, she was never the woman you thought she was. I let out a breath, staring at the city lights outside my window. No, I said quietly. She wasn't. And now, it was time to let her go. Even after cutting Melanie off completely, I knew she wouldn't just disappear quietly. She wasn't the type to accept consequences, she was the type to rewrite the story. And sure enough, within days, she tried exactly that. It started with the lawyers. She wasn't just fighting the divorce, she was trying to play the victim. Her legal team sent over a proposal that was almost laughable. Melanie claimed she had been forced into this situation, that Patrick had threatened her, that she had only acted out of fear. She was asking for a settlement, citing emotional distress, and claiming she had lost everything because of my vindictive actions. Jason nearly threw his phone across the room when he read the documents. "Unbelievable," he muttered. "She's actually trying to paint herself as the victim." I shook my head, rubbing my temple. "Let her try. It won't change a thing." My legal team tore through her claims. Every shred of evidence we had, her phone records, the recorded conversations, the bank transactions linking her to Patrick's network, was laid out on the table. I made it clear, she was not walking away with a dime. And when she realized she couldn't win in court, she did what desperate people do. She ran to the media. I woke up to my phone buzzing non-stop. Jason stormed into my office, his face tight with anger. "Have you seen the headlines?" I grabbed my phone and scrolled. And there it was, her last pathetic attempt at control. Billionaire CEO's wife speaks out. I was manipulated into betraying my husband. The article was an exclusive interview with Melanie. In it, she claimed she had been trapped in a conspiracy orchestrated by Patrick Lawson, that she had been pressured into trying to take over Miller Analytics out of fear for her life. She played up the terrified wife angle, claiming she had loved Thomas deeply but had been pushed into a corner. The worst part? Some people believed her. Comments flooded in, some calling her a liar, but others sympathizing with her. Saying I was too harsh, that maybe I had misunderstood her involvement, that she was just another victim of corporate greed. Jason slammed his fist on the desk. "We have to respond." I exhaled slowly. "No, we don't." His eyes widened. "Dad, we can't let her get away with this. People are actually feeling sorry for her." "She's already lost," I said simply. "This is just her trying to control the narrative. It won't change anything." And I was right. While the media storm raged on, the legal system didn't care about sob stories. Patrick was already knee-deep in his own legal troubles, and Melanie? She was about to have her own reckoning. Because a week later, the police came knocking at her door. The investigation into my car accident had concluded, and the results were damning. A forensic analysis confirmed intentional tampering with the brake lines. The payments Melanie had sent to an independent contractor were traced back to a known fixer with ties to Patrick's company. She wasn't just a co-conspirator anymore. She was a prime suspect. She was arrested in broad daylight. Cameras caught her in handcuffs, her face a mix of shock and humiliation. Her last desperate act had failed. Jason and I watched the footage in silence. When it ended, he turned to me. "So that's it." I nodded. "That's it." For the first time in weeks, I felt something close to peace. Melanie had always been a woman who thrived on control. She knew how to manipulate, how to turn situations in her favor, how to make herself look like the innocent party. But now? Now she was sitting in a courtroom, stripped of the power she once had. No carefully crafted story could save her here. The evidence was overwhelming, and the truth was finally catching up to her. The trial moved quickly. The prosecution laid everything out, her secret meetings with Patrick, the phone records, the forged documents attempting to transfer my shares, and most damning of all, the financial trail that led straight to the man who tampered with my brakes. I sat in that courtroom, watching it all unfold, and for the first time, I saw the real Melanie. Not the woman I had married. Not the woman I had spent 22 years of my life with. Just a desperate, selfish person who had thrown everything away for greed. Her defense? A joke. She stuck to her sob story, claiming she had no idea Patrick was planning anything malicious, that she was forced into everything, that she was manipulated and scared for her life. She even played up the devoted wife act, pretending to still care about me. "I never wanted to hurt Thomas," she told the jury, voice shaking, eyes full of fake remorse. I was trapped. I was afraid. I didn't know what to do. Jason sat beside me, jaw clenched, watching her with barely contained fury. I could feel it too, that urge to stand up and call out every lie spilling from her mouth. But I didn't need to. The prosecution tore her story apart piece by piece, showing the cold, calculated way she had gone about everything. Patrick Lawson, ever the survivor, had already flipped. His legal team cut a deal, throwing Melanie under the bus in exchange for a reduced sentence. He admitted to everything, how she had approached him first, how she had proposed the idea of pushing me out, and how she had agreed to eliminating me when I refused to hand over my company. The moment that confession played in court, Melanie's whole facade crumbled. The jury didn't take long. Guilty. On multiple counts: fraud, conspiracy, attempted murder. She was sentenced to 25 years. No parole for at least 15. When the verdict was read, she turned to look at me. I expected anger, hatred, maybe even another pathetic attempt at pleading. But what I saw in her eyes was worse. Not for what she had done. Not for betraying me. But because she had lost. As the bailiff led her away, Jason let out a slow breath. "It's over." I nodded, but I didn't feel relief. Not yet. Because even though Melanie was out of my life, the damage she had done was still there. The company had barely survived the scandal. Jason and I had been putting out fires for weeks. And me? I had spent over 2 decades with a woman who had been capable of this. That kind of betrayal doesn't disappear overnight. But as I walked out of that courtroom, for the first time in a long time, I felt something I hadn't felt since this nightmare started. The courtroom doors shut behind me, and for the first time in months, I could breathe. No more lawyers. No more secret meetings. No more wondering if Melanie was lurking in the background, waiting to make her next move. She was gone. Locked away. And yet, as I stood outside, the cold air biting at my skin, I didn't feel the satisfaction I thought I would. Jason stood beside me, hands in his pockets, staring at the ground. "So what now?" His voice was quiet, like he wasn't sure if he should even be asking. I didn't have an answer. For weeks, I had focused on one thing: exposing Melanie, stopping Patrick, making sure neither of them could hurt us again. And now that it was done, I realized I hadn't thought about what came after. 22 years of marriage, wiped out. The woman I had trusted, shared a life with, had been plotting against me for months. Maybe longer. I built a company from nothing, worked my way up from a man with nothing but ambition, and I still got played in the worst way. The thought of it made my stomach turn. I exhaled slowly and looked at Jason. Now we move forward. It was easier said than done. The media didn't just move on overnight. Every business blog, financial news outlet, and gossip site had a take on what happened. Billionaire CEO's wife sentenced in corporate betrayal. The headlines made it sound like a damn movie. Reporters called the office nonstop, some even camping outside my house for a few days, hoping I'd give them a statement. I didn't. I let the lawyers handle everything. I was done feeding into the circus. Miller Analytics took a hit from the scandal, but it wasn't fatal. Some clients backed out, wary of the drama, but Jason and I worked around the clock to repair the damage. Investors were hesitant, board members were still recovering from the shock, but Jason proved himself in a way I hadn't expected. He stepped up, took on more responsibilities, and by the end of the month, people weren't just seeing him as my son, they were seeing him as a leader. I was proud of him. I just didn't know if I had it in me to keep going the way I used to. One night, I sat alone in my office, staring at the skyline, a whiskey glass in my hand. The company was stable. Jason was thriving. The storm had passed. And yet I felt empty. The house was too quiet. The routines I had spent years building were shattered. I had spent so much time fighting to survive that I didn't know what to do now that I had one. That was when I made my decision. The next morning, I called Jason into my office. He sat down across from me, already sensing something was coming. "You're taking over," I said simply. His eyebrows shot up. "Wait. What?" "I'm stepping down as CEO," I continued, leaning back in my chair. "I'll stay on as an advisor, but I'm done running this company day to day. You've proven you can handle it. Now it's your turn." Jason was silent for a long time, processing. "Are you sure?" I nodded. "It's time." He didn't argue. He just nodded, determination settling in his features. "I won't let you down." I knew he wouldn't. The announcement shocked everyone, but I didn't care. I packed up my office, handed over the keys, and walked out of Miller Analytics without looking back. 20 years ago, I built it from nothing. Now, I was leaving it in good hands. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't thinking about my company. I wasn't thinking about revenge or betrayal. I was thinking about what I wanted. Walking away from Miller Analytics should have been harder. I had spent decades building it, shaping it into something unstoppable. But as I stepped out of that office for the last time, handing the reins to Jason, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: peace. No more late nights worrying about corporate takeovers. No more board meetings full of hidden agendas. No more looking over my shoulder, wondering if the people closest to me were plotting against me. I sold the house. There was no point in staying somewhere that felt more like a graveyard of broken trust than a home. Every room reminded me of Melanie, the lies, the manipulation, the nights I sat beside her in bed, thinking she was my partner when she was actually planning my downfall. So I let it go. Found a quiet place outside the city, something smaller, something mine. Melanie wrote to me from prison. 3 letters so far. I never opened them. I knew what they'd say, apologies, excuses, maybe even desperate pleas for forgiveness. But I had nothing left to give her. She had made her choices, and now she had to live with them. One evening, Jason showed up with a bottle of whiskey, settling into the chair next to me on the back porch. We sat in silence for a while, just watching the sun dip below the trees. "You think you'll ever start over?" he asked, swirling the drink in his glass. I let out a slow breath, staring at the horizon. Maybe. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't thinking about revenge, or betrayal, or what I had lost. I was just thinking about what came next. The days stretched out slower now, quieter. No more back-to-back meetings, no more urgent calls from lawyers, no more calculated betrayals waiting around the corner. Just me, waking up in a home that felt mine for the first time in years. Melanie's letters stopped coming. Maybe she finally realized there was nothing left to say. Or maybe she just gave up trying to manipulate someone who was done playing her game. Either way, I didn't care. She was locked away, Patrick was buried under legal battles of his own, and the company I built was in good hands. Jason checked in on me often, sometimes with updates about Miller Analytics, sometimes just to talk. I could tell he worried I might be struggling without the business to keep me busy, but the truth was, I needed this time. For years, I had built, fought, defended. Now for the first time, I was just living. One weekend, he convinced me to take a trip. Nothing big, just a few days in the mountains, away from the city, away from everything. I hadn't traveled for myself in years. Every trip had been for work, every moment spent thinking about the next deal, the next step. But as I stood there, looking out over the valley, the crisp air filling my lungs, I realized something. I wasn't lost. I wasn't broken. I wasn't ruined by what happened. I had survived. I turned to Jason, who was watching me carefully, waiting to see if I regretted coming. I clapped a hand on his shoulder, smirking. "You really thought I'd sit around miserable for the rest of my life?" He chuckled, shaking his head. "Nah. But I figured you might need the reminder." Maybe I did. I wasn't the same man I had been before Melanie's betrayal. I was sharper, less trusting, maybe a little colder. But I was free. And for the first time in a long time, the future was mine to decide. Not hers. Not theirs. Mine.